What if the image of Jesus most people know today is incomplete? For centuries, Western Christianity has presented Christ as gentle, calm, and almost distant, an image shaped by art, translation, and theology, but deep in the ancient manuscripts of Ethiopia. A radically different portrait of Jesus has been preserved, one that is older, more intense, and far more powerful. In these texts, Jesus is not merely a humble teacher walking quietly through history. He is described as a radiant being whose presence silences angels, whose eyes burn like fire, whose voice moves like rushing waters, and whose existence predates the creation of the sun itself. Yet at the same time, he is profoundly human, close, intimate, and deeply connected to the inner life of every person. This vision of Christ was not shaped by Rome, medieval councils, or later European traditions. It comes from one of the oldest Christian civilizations on earth, a tradition that claims its faith did not begin with missionaries, but with ancient roots already waiting for Christ. In this video, we explore how the Ethiopian Bible describes Jesus and what this forgotten image might reveal about who he truly is and who we are in relation to him. In the Ethiopian biblical tradition, Jesus is not introduced first as a teacher, a moral guide, or even a historical figure. He is introduced as a presence. The texts describe him as someone whose arrival alters the atmosphere itself. Angels fall silent, creation responds. His appearance is not comforting in a soft sense, but overwhelming in a profound one. This is not fear in the human sense, but awe, the reaction of beings encountering something greater than language. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Christ with imagery that is strikingly consistent across multiple texts. His eyes are described as burning like fire, not as a symbol of anger, but of penetrating awareness. Nothing is hidden from his gaze. His skin is compared to polished bronze, glowing rather than reflecting light, suggesting strength, endurance, and permanence. His voice is said to sound like rushing waters, not loud for spectacle, but powerful enough to move everything it touches. This description is important because it tells us how the earliest believers in this tradition understood Jesus. They did not see him as fragile or merely symbolic. They saw him as real, weighty, and authoritative, someone whose presence demanded attention, not admiration. Yet, and this is crucial, these same texts refuse to separate that power from humanity. The Ethiopian Christ is not distant. He does not stand apart from the human condition. Instead, he enters it fully, while retaining something unmistakably divine within him. The texts emphasize that he walks among people without revealing his full nature. He eats, speaks, and suffers as a human being, but carries an inner light that remains unrecognized by most. This balance between majesty and closeness is central to the Ethiopian view. Jesus is not powerful instead of being human. He is powerful while being human. In books like the Ascension of Isaiah, preserved completely only in the Ethiopian tradition, Christ is described as descending through layers of heaven. With each descent, he lays aside visible glory, becoming less recognizable to the beings below. By the time he reaches the human world, even angels no longer recognize him for who he truly is. This idea matters because it predates later theological debates about the nature of Christ. It suggests that belief in Jesus as both divine and human was not a later invention, but an original conviction preserved outside Roman influence. The Ethiopian texts also emphasize that Jesus did not begin to exist when he was born. In the Book of Enoch, he appears not by name, but as the chosen Son of Man. His name is said to exist before the sun, before the stars, before time itself. He is described as the one through whom order was given to creation. In this vision, Jesus is not simply in history. History moves through him. This challenges the modern tendency to reduce Jesus to a moral figure or cultural symbol. The Ethiopian manuscripts resist that simplification. They insist that Christ is foundational, woven into reality itself. And yet, despite this cosmic scale, the texts repeatedly return to one point: his closeness. They describe him as someone who understands human fear, doubt, and suffering because he chose to enter them. His authority does not come from distance, but from participation. He knows humanity from the inside. This is why the Ethiopian portrayal of Jesus feels so intense. It refuses to make him safe or manageable. It also refuses to make him unreachable. He is overwhelming but present, ancient but near, divine but not detached. This is the Jesus preserved in Ethiopian Scripture, not softened by later traditions, not reduced by art or doctrine, but remembered as a being whose presence still demands a response. The way Jesus is described in the Ethiopian tradition is not accidental. It reflects a theological understanding that developed outside the influence of Roman councils, imperial politics, and later European cultural frameworks. In these texts, Jesus is not primarily defined by doctrine. He is defined by essence, Western Christianity, especially after the early councils, focused heavily on classification, divine or human, nature or substance, authority or obedience. These debates were necessary in their context, but they also narrowed how Christ was described and understood. Over time, Jesus became increasingly framed through theological formulas and artistic conventions. The Ethiopian texts take a different approach. They focus less on defining Christ and more on encountering him. This is why the descriptions are so vivid. Fire, light, sound, weight, presence. These are not decorative images. They are attempts to express something that cannot be reduced to a concept. The Ethiopian tradition does not ask first, what doctrine does Jesus represent? It asks, what happens when he appears? And the answer is consistent. Everything changes. One of the most striking elements in these texts is how Jesus relates to human beings. He is not portrayed as someone who stands above humanity as an unreachable ideal. Instead, he is portrayed as someone who recognizes something familiar within every person. Several Ethiopian writings emphasize that human beings carry an inner spark, something placed there at the beginning of creation. Jesus is described not as the source of that spark, but as the one who awakens it. Salvation, in this framework, is not blind obedience or external conformity. It is recognition. This is a critical point. It explains why these texts were uncomfortable for institutional authority. If Jesus speaks directly to the human heart, if divine light already exists within the human being, then the role of institutions becomes secondary. Guidance remains important, but control becomes impossible. The Ethiopian texts imply that no structure can replace personal transformation. This does not deny discipline or community. It shifts the center. In this vision, Jesus does not come to build an institution first. He comes to restore awareness. This idea appears clearly in Ethiopian interpretations of Christ's own words. When Jesus says, "You are the light of the world," these texts do not treat it as metaphor or encouragement. They treat it as a literal statement. Humanity is described as originating from light, temporarily obscured but never destroyed. Jesus, then, is not bringing something foreign to humanity. He is reminding humanity of what it already carries. This understanding reshapes how his authority is viewed. Jesus is powerful not because he dominates, but because he reveals. His presence exposes truth, not by force, but by clarity. This is why his eyes are described as fire, not to threaten, but to illuminate. By contrast, Western portrayals gradually soften Jesus over centuries. Artistic traditions emphasize gentleness, suffering, and serenity, often at the expense of intensity and authority. While these qualities are not wrong, they became incomplete. Christ was made safe, predictable, and emotionally distant. The Ethiopian tradition resisted that shift. Its Christ remains overwhelming, not cruel, not violent, but impossible to ignore. Someone whose presence demands decision, silence, attention. This is why Ethiopian iconography looks different. Christ is often painted with wide, penetrating eyes, strong colors, direct gaze. The images are not meant to soothe, they are meant to confront. They reflect a belief that Jesus is not merely to be admired, but encountered. And that may be the most challenging aspect of this tradition. It does not allow Jesus to remain an idea, a symbol, or a cultural figure. It insists that he is alive, active, and personally involved in the inner life of each person. This may explain why these texts survived in isolation. Ethiopian monks copied them for centuries, not because they were rebellious, but because they believed they were preserving something essential, an image of Christ too important to be lost. An image not softened by power structures, not filtered by empire, not reduced to doctrine alone. A Jesus who is light, presence, and truth, experienced, not managed. When all these Ethiopian texts are placed side by side, one conclusion becomes difficult to ignore. The image of Jesus they preserve is larger, heavier, and more demanding than the version many people have inherited. This is not a different Jesus, but a fuller one. In the Ethiopian tradition, Christ is not reduced to a historical memory or a moral example. He is described as a living presence, pre-existent, radiant, and deeply involved in the structure of reality itself. He is powerful without being distant, divine without abandoning humanity, overwhelming without being cruel. Most importantly, he is not portrayed as someone who separates humanity from God, but as someone who reveals how close that connection has always been. These texts insist that the divine is not locked away in institutions, images, or distant heavens. They describe a Christ who speaks directly to the inner life of the human being, who awakens rather than controls, who reveals rather than replaces. This may explain why this vision was preserved far from the centers of power. It was not convenient, it was not easily managed, and it did not allow faith to remain superficial. The Ethiopian Jesus does not ask to be admired from a distance. He asks to be recognized, as modern technology uncovers manuscripts that were once hidden in remote monasteries. The question is no longer whether this image of Christ existed. The evidence is clear that it did. The real question now is personal. If Jesus is not only a figure of the past, but a presence woven into reality itself, if his light is not only something to worship, but something meant to awaken what is already within us, then what does it mean to follow him today? And have we truly been seeing him as he is, or only as we were taught to see him?